5% corporate tax with a company in Madeira. In this video, you'll find out how it works and which requirements you absolutely have to meet. Hello and welcome. My name is Florian Wilk. I have been the Managing Director of CMC for 15 years now. And in this video, I'll explain to you what the advantages of Madeira are, what you need to pay attention to if you're considering setting up a company in Madeira, and how we can potentially support you with that. And of course, most importantly, what are the legal requirements? What are the minimum standards that absolutely have to be met? So make sure to watch the video all the way to the end to get all the information. And of course, you can also book a free and non-binding initial consultation with me at any time. You'll find the link below this video, and then we can take a look at your individual situation and of course see whether Madeira is the right location for your business or your project. So let's get started. So first of all, it's important to know that the standard corporate tax rate in Madeira is 14.7%. This basically applies to all companies that are registered in Madeira. And then, of course, there's the International Business Center, the IBC. That's a special economic zone in Madeira, which is actually used by only a few thousand companies. It's still something of an insider tip. And what's special about the IBC is that only 5% corporate tax is due. It has existed since the 1980s. Back then, they decided they wanted to promote Madeira because as an Atlantic island, it's naturally very isolated from the rest of Portugal and, of course, from the EU in general. And the goal with this 5% incentive program ultimately is to attract and bring companies to the island and, of course, to create jobs. And since then, every few years, the EU has extended this special regime, this special legislation, and this exemption at the end of the day. And the big drawback that I often notice with Madeira is that people are afraid, will this continue? Is it still valid until 2030, 2040? You just don't know for sure yet. Personally, I'm relatively relaxed about it. Of course, no one has a crystal ball, but if something has been continued over and over again for so many decades, then I think you can have a certain basic trust that it will continue like that in the future. Of course, there is no guarantee. But I think you really shouldn't drive yourself crazy about it, in quotation marks, if in doubt. Always be prepared that maybe one day this doesn't happen overnight, but over the course of a year or two, you might have to change your location. Don't get me wrong, it's always especially important to me that you have stable long-term setups. I find that extremely important, and I always pay special attention to stability, especially when recommending locations. Nevertheless, as I said, Madeira has worked well for many decades. So why should things suddenly be different in the near future? I just consider that to be relatively unlikely, but you always have a certain residual risk. But of course, that's also the case in every other jurisdiction with very, very few exceptions. But as I said, if you want to compare whether Madeira is right for you or maybe Malta, Cyprus, Georgia or Singapore would suit you better, then the way is always open for a personal conversation. Because of course you can't do something like that in a YouTube video, and certainly not for individual cases. So that's the downside, in quotation marks, that the whole thing is only clear for a few years at a time and then ultimately keeps getting extended. That's an important point. You just need to be aware of that. Then, as a requirement, at least one job must be created. There's a table for that depending on the profit. Several jobs may also need to be created, but here you have actually a relatively generous basis. So in most cases, at least with our clients, it's really enough if you create just one job. Of course, you also have the option to create multiple jobs, but it's not necessary. But you do need at least one person, and they should also be working full-time for the company, which is very important. So really a regular 40-hour work week. And the minimum wage is around 900 euros. It was just changed recently. I think it's currently 960 euros. So let's say roughly 1,000 euros minimum wage that you should expect. Of course, the more qualified this person is, the higher the salary will be. If you pay a salary of 1,400 or 1,500 euros, you can already get well-qualified English-speaking employees who can work in areas like support, administration, social media management, and similar fields. And I would actually see that as an advantage. You have lower labor costs than, for example, in Germany, but you get very motivated employees. So you really have well-educated people in Madeira. So it's actually a win-win situation. On the one hand, of course, you need an employee. That's a basic requirement. On the other hand, you simply save money if you hire an employee in Madeira compared to Germany, and you also have a certain level of education and training. That's a classic win-win situation. Then it's important to know that there is also an investment requirement, namely an investment of 75,000 euros. Here again, at first glance, you might think that's quite a lot of money. How does that work? But you can structure that as well. Let me just give a few examples. You can invest in real estate. In some cases, that can even be a property used as a private residence. Of course, you can just as well invest in an office, in office space. That's one option, one possibility. You can also, for example, invest in business assets. Maybe you need computers, hardware, or other things. You simply need certain business assets for the company. It could also be a vehicle. That's possible too. Or as we recently had a case, someone wanted to invest in a boat. In that case, there are a few requirements, namely that it has to sail under the Portuguese flag, but that's basically doable as well, I think. So that's another possibility. Or they can also be intangible business assets, such as trademark rights or software. So if the company buys software or acquires a trademark right for at least 75,000 euros, that's also feasible. And it's important to know that you have 2 years, or rather the company has 2 years to make these investments. Also with the employee, which I hadn't mentioned yet, you have 6 months. And what happens? This is of course the obvious question. What happens if the requirements aren't met? Well, then I revert to the 14.7%. That's important to know. What we also sometimes do is set up a company, but not immediately in the IBC, the Special Economic Zone. Instead, we first establish a regular company in Madeira, and then later, in a second step, namely when the activities actually begin, sometimes you're still waiting for certain contracts or preparatory actions, we move it. And when the time comes, you can of course move into the Special Economic Zone. Then you also save yourself, it's not much, but you do save some licensing costs. There is a one-time licensing fee and an annual licensing fee. But that's almost symbolic. These aren't large amounts, but it's worth mentioning here. You also have more time to meet the requirements. And I think 6 months to hire an employee and 2 years to make this investment is an absolutely realistic time frame that you can easily work with. So of course, substance is always important. I mentioned that indirectly. The employee or employees, that is already a form of substance, of course. You need a place of business, so it's also important that there is a real office, which really goes without saying. A mailbox alone is of course not enough. We also support you with that. You are welcome to rent an office in our premises, or we can help you find office space externally. That's something we're also very happy to help with. It's important for you to know. You need the employee, you need the office, you need the investment, and of course, management should always be on site as well. So this employee can also be the managing director at the same time, or you can separate the roles and perhaps have a trustee managing director in Madeira and an employee. So of course, this is always something to be considered on a case-by-case basis, but these are the usual things. Of course, you can also combine both roles, but what doesn't work is having one employee working for several companies. That's not possible. That's also important information if you're considering optimizing or something like that. As for the activities, you should always check each case individually. Not every activity is permitted in the Special Economic Zone. So we can coordinate that with you on a case-by-case basis in a one-on-one conversation and see whether the desired activity is generally suitable. One very positive thing, in my opinion, is that you can combine different activities. So you can absolutely say the company manages my yacht, and the yacht is also the company's investment. And at the same time, the company provides certain consulting services. So that's definitely possible. That's a common combination. Maybe one thing to wrap up, something that might not be entirely unimportant. Portugal is, of course, a fiscally, let's say, highly developed country. The regulations are relatively complex, and that's why it's always important to really examine each individual case separately in cooperation with our local partners. As a rule, we arrive at a satisfactory solution. But it's not an offshore location or anything comparable to the typical mailbox jurisdictions or anything like that. Things are, of course, in order and must be correct in Madeira. That's why it's important to get serious and sound advice and not to make any rash decisions or quickly set up a Madeira IBC, but to approach the whole thing in a structured way and with the appropriate support. If you would like a bit of support, if you want to present your setup or your plans, then feel free to take the opportunity and book a non-binding initial consultation with me so we can discuss your plans together. And as you may know, as CMC, we are also present in other locations on Cyprus, in Georgia, in Ireland, in Singapore, and can therefore really provide support across a broad range. And not only that, not just limited to one location. It often also makes sense to choose a combination. For example, having your tax residency in Cyprus, because the non-dom regime offers very attractive benefits, but maybe you want to run your company in Madeira or in Georgia or in Singapore. So you can, of course, combine these wonderfully to develop the optimal overall package for yourself, so to speak. So I want to thank you very, very much for your attention. I'd be happy if you give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. And please also subscribe to my channel. That helps me to keep growing and to reach 10,000 subscribers. Thank you so much again for your attention. I wish you all the best and see you soon.